Hello and welcome to my channel. In this video we will be looking at AQA AS Psychology Specimen 1 Paper 1 Exemplar Answers for Social Influence, which you need to know for AQA A-Level Psychology. I hope you enjoy this video and find it helpful. Let's get started. Please note that these answers have been produced with knowledge of the mark scheme but have not been approved by the mark scheme themselves. There are 3 assessment objectives, AOs, in psychology. In this video they are color-coded. AO1 Knowledge, purple. AO2 Application, blue. AO3 Evaluation, red and green. In AS there are 12 mark questions, instead of 16 mark questions. For the purpose of this video and to avoid confusion for A-Level, the 12 mark questions have been turned into 16 mark questions. Question 1. Which 2 of the following are types of conformity? Shade 2 boxes only. 2 marks. A. Agentic state. B. Compliance. C. Group size. D. Identification. E. Unanimity. B. Compliance. D. Identification. Question 2. Briefly outline and evaluate the authoritarian personality as an explanation of obedience to authority. 4 marks. The authoritarian personality is a dispositional explanation proposed by Theodor Adorno, 1950, and suggests obedient behavior is caused by internal traits, characteristics, and dispositions of the individual such as personality type, rather than external situational factors. This collection of traits and dispositions are developed in childhood from strict, harsh, and rigid parenting. This creates resentment within the child as they grow up and, since they cannot express it at the time, their feelings are displaced onto others who are seen as weak or inferior. A person is seen to be harsh, hostile, and dominate towards people of perceived lower status, scapegoating. But conformist, conventional, dogmatic, respectful towards people of perceived authority and obedient, servile towards people of perceived higher status. A strength of the authoritarian personality is that there is research to support the link between authoritarian personality and obedience. Elms and Milgram, 1966, interviewed participants who went to 450V. They all completed the F scale as part of the interview. These 20 participants scored significantly higher on the overall F scale than a comparison group of 20 disobedient participants. The 2 groups were clearly quite different in terms of authoritarianism. Those who were more obedient also reported being more distant to their fathers during their childhood, which supports the possibility of the authoritarian personality having been learnt through social modeling. This is a strength because it suggests that there is a strong link between authoritarian personality traits and obedience levels. The study's findings provide evidence of how individuals with higher authoritarian tendencies tend to exhibit greater obedience to authority figures, reinforcing the theory's premise regarding the relationship between authoritarianism and obedience. Read the item and then answer the question that follows. The following article appeared in a newspaper. Britain's views on homosexuality, the biggest social change of the last 30 years. In the UK, views on homosexuality have changed significantly in recent times. 30 years ago, almost 2/3 of the British public opposed same-sex relationships because they were morally wrong. These days, homosexuality is accepted and the majority of British people support recent changes to the laws on gay marriage and adoption. Question 3. With reference to the article above, explain how social influence leads to social change. 6 marks. Social change occurs when whole societies, not just individuals, change and adopt new attitudes, beliefs, or behaviors through minority influence processes, e.g. when a minority view challenges a majority view and is eventually accepted as the majority. 30 years ago, homosexuality was viewed as morally wrong and therefore the group norm was to opposite same-sex marriage as it was seen as wrong and unpleasant. This meant that young people would be influenced by normative social influence to oppose same-sex marriage or risk social rejection from the group, which eventually led to informational social influence, as people wanted to be right. However, as time went on, a minority of individuals began to understand that same-sex marriage was not morally wrong and used minority influence processes to enact social change. The minority were successfully able to stay consistent and not deviate from their message that same-sex marriage was not morally wrong despite social pressures. The minority would have been able to form gay rights pressure groups to help gain support and form communities with people who had the same beliefs. This would have shown the majority that this viewpoint was something the minority truly believed in and had believed in for a long period of time. The minority were able to show commitment, augmentation principle, by putting themselves at risk or inconvenience and show that they were willing to make personal sacrifices to the cause in order to get their message across to others. This would have helped the minority to convince the majority to listen to the message and drawn more attention to the cause. This would have been done through a variety of methods such as protests, marches, strikes, lobbying, boycotting, and campaigns. The minority would have also volunteered their time to spread awareness that live is love and that same-sex marriage was not morally wrong, highlighting how they truly believed in their message. The minority would have shown a degree of flexibility and would have been willing to adapt and listen to valid and reasonable counterarguments. Instead, the minority would have compromised by asking people to just accept same-sex marriage instead of agree and understand it. This would have made the majority listen and take the message seriously and would have made the minority seem less rigid and dogmatic. Over time, the majority would have started to internalize this message. This would have acted as a snowball effect, slowly and gradually gathering momentum and members until there becomes a tipping point and the minority becomes the majority and uses the social pressure of normative social influence such as young people today who are more concerned with people being happy and who they are and frown on peers who are homophobic. This then would have resulted in social crypto-amnesia where people are aware change occurred but forget the origins of the original viewpoint, mostly likely because the individual had held negative views of the belief which they have now adopted. Instead of identifying with the minority group, individuals will dissociate the minority views from the people who promoted them. People of today have a memory that it was previously socially acceptable to oppose same-sex marriage, however they are unaware of where this view changed, mostly likely because they opposed same-sex marriage at some point in their lives and thought that it was wrong and unpleasant. As time moved on, supporting same-sex marriage started to become a social norm. More and more people started to conform with this viewpoint to avoid the risk of social rejection and fit in. People started to believe and agree that same-sex marriage was acceptable, with those who chose to be openly homophobic facing the risk of social rejection, as their behavior violated social norms. Eventually, this led to informational social influence, where people finally internalized the beliefs of the minority as a result of wanting to be right. As time moved on, more people started to realize that same-sex marriage was not morally wrong. People have become convinced by evidence, research, data, and statistics, and therefore their views and opinions changed. Over time, dictators, government lawmakers, through power and authority have created and changed laws and rules on same-sex marriage, e.g. same-sex couples are now allowed to get married. This made same-sex marriage more of a social norm and led to groups of people changing their behavior and beliefs because of the fear of punishment and consequences of not obeying. Question 4. Describe and evaluate 2 studies of social influence. 16 marks. One study investigating social influence is Ask, 1951. He conducted a laboratory study to investigate the extent to which social pressure from a majority group could affect a person to conform in an unambiguous situation when an obviously wrong answer was given to a simple question by other members of a group. Ask used 123 American male college student volunteers from Swarthmore College in the USA, who believed they were taking part in a test of vision. Participants were each placed in a 6 to 8 Confederates, actors who were in on the experiment, and shown a stimulus line and then 3 other lines labeled A, B or C and asked to match the length of a single line to one of 3 comparison lines. They were then asked one by one to say out loud which of the 3 sets of lines that were shown matched the stimulus line. The naive participant was placed second to last or last when giving a response, and the Confederates were instructed to give the incorrect answer on 12 out of 18 trials, the critical trials. The results were compared to a control group in which no Confederates were used. On the critical trials, about 36.8% of the participants, over a one-third, conformed to the clearly incorrect majority proportion of critical trials when the participants agreed with the Confederates' wrong answers. This shows a high level of conformity, called the Ask effect, the extent to which people conform even in an unambiguous situation. 75% of participants conformed at least once during the experiment, 25% of participants never conformed, 1% of incorrect answers were genuine mistakes, and 0.7% of participants gave incorrect answers in the control group. Most participants said they conformed to avoid rejection, NSI, and continued to privately trust their own opinions, compliance. Ask concluded that people are likely to conform to group opinions even when they are clearly wrong, due to the pressure to fit in, normative social influence. A limitation of Asker's research is that his study suffers from gender bias. The sample consisted of males only. Netto, 1995, suggested that women might be more conformist, possibly because they are more concerned about social relationships and being accepted. An all-female group or mixed group, do both males and females, might have a different result outcome to the results gained from Asker's study. This is a limitation because it suggests that the findings of the study cannot be generalized to the wider population and other genders, e.g. women. A second limitation of Asker's research is that it suffers from cultural bias. The sample consisted of participants from the USA. The USA is an Western country which has an individualist culture. Smith and Bond, 1998, suggest that conformity rates are higher in collectivist cultures, e.g. China, which are more concerned with group needs. This is a limitation because it suggests that the findings of the study cannot be generalized to the wider population and other cultures, e.g. China. A second study investigating social influence was conducted by Milgram, 1963. Milgram published his research 6 months after the execution of Adolf Eichmann for his part in the murder of millions of Jews in the Holocaust. During his trial, and just like many other war criminals brought to justice, he maintained he was only obeying orders given to him. Milgram aimed to investigate whether ordinary people would obey a legitimate authority figure even when required to injure and inflict harm into an innocent person. He used 40 male American volunteers, between 20 to 50 years old, who responded to an advert in the newspaper, were recruited and were told they were participating in a study on learning and memory. They were invited to attend at the prestigious location of Yale University's psychology laboratory. Volunteers were invited individually and on arrival were introduced to an experimenter in a white coat and another middle-aged man who they were led to believe was another volunteer named Mr. Wallace, when in truth he was a Confederate. The naive participant was told Milgram's experiment was about how punishment affected learning, and one person would be the teacher while the other would be the learner. The naive participant and Mr. Wallace drew lots to decide which role they would play. However, this was rigged, so the naive participant would always be the teacher and Mr. Wallace, the Confederate, would always be the learner. They were placed in a room with a shock generator, and the naive participant, who was the designated teacher, was instructed to administer an increasingly severe electric shock to the learner every time they answered a question incorrectly in a word pairing task. Shocks ranged from 15 volts, slight shock, to 450 volts, danger, severe shock. The naive participant was given a shock of 45 volts to convince him this was authentic, and Mr. Wallace, learner Confederate, was strapped to the chair in the room next door. Mr. Wallace, learner Confederate, who was not actually receiving shocks, known to the naive participant, teacher, was told to give mostly incorrect answers. Each time he was shocked by the naive participant for an incorrect response, varied recorded responses were played of increasing pain and distress. At 150 volts, the learner would begin to protest and refuse to take part further in the study, complaining of heart problems. At 315 volts, he would scream loudly, and from 330 volts and upwards, he would not respond at all. If the naive participant, teacher, objected or displayed resistance to continue, they were given a series of verbal prods to continue the experiment, e.g. please continue. The experiment requires that you continue, and you have no other choice, you must go on, by an authority figure, experimenter, who wore a lab coat. 65% of participants administered the highest level of shock, 450 volts, despite apparent distress and reluctance. 100% of the participants went up to at least 300 volts. Only 5 participants, 12.5%, stopped administering shocks at 300 volts. Some participants began to show signs of distress such as laughing nervously, sweating, stuttering, biting their lip, groaning, digging their fingernails into their hands or trembling, while others showed no signs of distress, focusing on only administering the shocks and continued to obey. Qualitative observations. Some participants also argued with the experimenter, however still continued to obey. 3 participants had full-blown uncontrollable seizures with no past history of seizures. Prior to carrying out his experiment, Milgram had asked 14 psychology students and other colleagues to predict how far participants would go. The majority of the opinion was no more than 3% would continue to 450 volts. Participants were debriefed and assured their behavior was normal. In a follow-up questionnaire, 84% reported they felt glad to have participated and 74% felt they had learned something of personal importance. The experiment demonstrated that ordinary people are likely to follow orders given by an authority figure, even to the extent of harming another individual. This suggests that situational factors, such as the presence of an authority figure, can significantly influence obedience. A limitation of Milgram's research is that it lacks internal validity. Orn and Holland, 1968, suggest participants guessed the electric shocks were fake. So Milgram was not testing what he intended to study, obedience. Further to this, Gina Perry's, 2013, research confirms this. She listened to tapes of Milgram's participants and reported that only about half of them believed the shocks were real. 2/3 of these participants were disobedient. This is a limitation because it suggests that participants may have been responding to demand characteristics, trying to fulfill the aims of the study. A second limitation of Milgram's research is that it broke ethical guidelines. Baumrind, 1964, criticized Milgram's deceptions. Milgram deceived participants into believing that they were taking part in a study on how punishment affects learning, rather than obedience. They were also deceived by the rigging of the role allocation that were in fact predetermined, and participants were also deceived into believing that the shock they were administering were real. Milgram did not protect the participants from psychological or physical harm, and this resulted in many participants showing extreme signs of distress and guilt throughout the experiment and afterwards knowing that they could have potentially harmed another human being. Milgram also refused his participants the right to withdraw, as when participants asked to stop, they were given verbal prods to encourage them to remain within the experiment. This is a limitation because it suggests that Milgram did not prioritize or think about his participants' psychological and physical well-being when participating in the study, and potentially damaged the reputation of psychologists and their research, as deception is a betrayal of trust and deception of participants may also make them less likely to volunteer for future research. However, it could be suggested that the study's breach of ethical guidelines could be justified by cost-benefit analysis, as the results and information gained from Milgram's research might put the ethical concerns involved. Milgram's study highlighted the dangers of blind obedience in certain situations. If participants weren't decided, then the stud would have lost validity, as it would be most likely that participants would display demand characteristics if they knew the true aim of the study. Furthermore, participants were debriefed and assured their behavior was normal. In a follow-up questionnaire, 84% reported they felt glad to have participated and 74% felt they had learned something of personal importance. This gained the research retrospective consent, and with the results stating that the majority of the participants were about to have taken part, this suggests that possibly the research may not have been so damaging. Thank you for watching. If you have enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe for more content like this. Bye.